Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the 2021 UALC Professional Development Committee Fall Retreat. My name is Rachel Wishkowski. I'm the current chair of the UALC Professional Development Committee, and we are just so excited to have you all here this morning for our kickoff event, Keynote by Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe. I have a few remarks just to get us started, kind of logistics and a general welcome. And then I'll hand it off to one of my colleagues, Duncan, to introduce our speaker. But before we get into anything, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement statement for our statewide organization. This is from my institution, which is Utah State University, and I've put the statement in chat for those of you who would like to read along while I read it. You can also turn on closed captions if you need them using the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. So as a land-grant institution, Utah State University campuses and centers and all UALC institutions reside and operate on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah who have been living, working, and residing on this land from time immemorial. These tribes are the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Indians, the Navajo Nation, the Ute Indian Tribe, the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone, the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, the San Juan Southern Paiute, the Skull Valley Band of Goshute, and the White Mesa Band of the Ute Mountain Ute. We acknowledge the historical context behind a painful history of genocide, forced removal, and dispossession of tribal peoples' lands on which USU exists. We acknowledge that these lands carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We recognize elders, past and present, as peoples who have cared for and continue to care for this land. And in offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, experiences, and resiliency of the Native peoples who are still here today. So thank you again for joining us. As we get started today, I did want to share some additional information. First off is a link to our retreat website where you can read more about our speakers, our agenda for the day. Chris, I believe, will post that in the chat, and we also have a tiny URL here. One of our other committee members, Brandon, set up a Twitter hashtag for us if you'd like to have a chat over on social media. And I just wanted to reassure everyone that Lisa's portion of this event is being recorded and will be posted on our retreat website after. Our other events this afternoon will not be recorded. An overview of our agenda is on the screen if you'd like to join us for other sections of the day. And we've enabled the chat so that you can build camaraderie and community and have some side channel conversations during our event. But we would really love for you to put questions for our speaker in the Q&A, and that will enable us to track them the easiest. And finally, a round of thank yous, first off to the UALC directors for funding our speakers today. And last but not least, the current members of the Professional Development Committee whose names are listed here. So at this point, I will stop sharing, let Lisa share her screen, and hand it over to Chris to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm Chris Yunkin. I'm one of the members of the UALC Professional Development Committee, and I'll be moderating our Q&A later in the session. But I wanted to introduce our speaker today. So Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe is professor and coordinator of information literacy services and instruction in the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, as well as affiliate faculty in the School of Information Sciences and Center for Global Studies. She is the PI on the IMLS-funded Prioritizing Privacy and the Mellon-funded Licensing Privacy projects. She served on the development team for the NISO Privacy Principles and is a co-author of a National Forum on Web Privacy and Web Analytics Action Handbook. And we're really pleased to have you here today. So I'll turn the time over to Lisa.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rachel, for the opportunity to join with you all today. And hello to everyone who I can only see in the chat right now. But I look forward to our dialogue here today. And if you are tweeting this talk, which I very much welcome, if you want to tag me on Twitter, you will find me as Lisa Librarian. So that tells you how early I got my Twitter handle, that I have Lisa Librarian. My talk today is titled, Whatever Happened to Reader Privacy? I think as librarians and library workers, we are very aware of our profession and our field's commitment to privacy, but we have also perhaps not been as attentive to some of the ways that changes in technology, information access, and the like have been impacting on reader privacy and what we might need to do in order to more proactively pursue our commitment to reader privacy and understand the dynamics that are currently at play. I'm going to start by grounding our conversation in the sort of fundamentals of the field and the profession, because the other thing I have discovered is that depending where one got one's MLS, you may or may not have been introduced to all of these in the same way. And then I think the other thing we must acknowledge is that our academic library employees have become more diverse in their backgrounds. We have people especially coming to us out of information technology, and of course we have allied professions like our business managers, our facilities managers, and the importance of our staff who are also on the front line working with users who have not necessarily had a chance to come through this. But I believe that many people are working in libraries specifically because of the kinds of value commitments that library professionals make, but that really are the values of our libraries. They aren't unique to us as the librarians or those with an MLS. They are unique to the kind of institution or organization that we are. And the fundamental way of putting this is our commitment to privacy is really tied to notions of freedom and agency, and in the academic environment, that intellectual and academic freedom that we want to be fostering. And this notion, though, is very tied as well to our commitments to democracy and to citizen participation and community engagement. And so it's all summed up in these 4 words: free people read freely. And we protect this notion that people can read freely in a lot of different ways because we believe in the importance of free people, that people have their freedom, and that reader privacy is one mechanism by which we have our freedoms. Now, it's not an unfettered, you can do whatever you want kind of freedom. We know that we live in a society. We know that we owe each other things as well, but that's the framework that I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves of. Why do we care about privacy? It's because of intellectual freedom and self-determination of peoples. And so what we have to attend to is, what are those things that can start to erode our free reading and reading freely? And one of those is surveillance and lack of privacy. So we find this commitment that libraries make actually best expressed, interestingly enough, in the Library Bill of Rights, which is actually a statement about what users can expect and demand of their libraries, which says, as we look to this, is that you read through this and you see this commitment to intellectual freedom, being able to choose one's path and the like. And that last statement sums it up: all people, regardless of origin, age, background, or views, possess a right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. This is a right of the user that we need to deliver on. Libraries should advocate for, educate about, and protect people's privacy, safeguarding all library use data, including personally identifiable information. So this is really situated, I think, interestingly, in what users have a right to. They have a right to privacy and confidentiality. And then, see, I even had a slide where I pulled it out. You've already looked at it, but this is so key. They have a right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. So we have to think about then, how do we ensure adherence to that right? We see in the interpretation of this Library Bill of Rights with respect to privacy that when users recognize or fear that their privacy or confidentiality is compromised, true freedom of inquiry no longer exists. So it's not even just that you know that your privacy has been compromised, but even once we think it might be, our freedom of inquiry is curtailed. And as it goes on to say, privacy is essential to the exercise of free speech, free thought, and free association. So sometimes people are like, well, we want to track people so that they don't do bad things, right? But see, that's already starting to curtail those freedoms. Now, we don't want people to do bad things, though we need to think about our mechanisms. And our mechanisms are situated strongly in this notion of free inquiry, freedom to read, and free association, and how that builds a better community. So what happens with our Library Bill of Rights is we see it paralleled in the ALA Code of Ethics. So the Bill of Rights is about users, and the ALA Code of Ethics speaks to then the responsibility of the library worker and the library as an institution. And it says, for example, that we provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. In other words, the way we engage with our user community is still situated strongly in notions of this freedom to inquire, this self-determination, and that we provide our services without judging whether somebody's, whether we agree with the particular thing being inquired about. And we go on to see intellectual freedom. And then number 3, we protect each library's users' right to privacy and confidentiality with respect to the information sought or received and resources consulted, borrowed, acquired, or transmitted. So this is the parallel statement. Users have a right to it, and it's our job to protect that right. And so we have this paralleling. In addition, you see in the addition that was added to the ALA Code of Ethics just this summer in 2021, plank number 9, which says that you see that we go on to say that we do this even more so from a social justice perspective and an equity perspective. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky sometimes for us as libraries, and we can talk about that later, because you actually need to know some things about your users in order to provide equitable and quality service. But what we know about them and how we know it matters. And that's what we'll unpack a little bit more now. So there's a privacy and confidentiality Q&A document that ALA provides to us, in which they sort of start to unpack, how do we do this thing? Like, it's a good lofty ideal, but then we have to do it in reality. So in a library, user privacy is the right to open inquiry without having the subject of one's interest examined or scrutinized by others. So you don't get a pre-examination, you don't get a scrutiny. And confidentiality exists when the library has information about your inquiry and it keeps that information private. So confidentiality is the library's responsibility. And confidentiality is the mechanism by which privacy is protected. Now, we can do this in a lot of different ways. One way that we protect the confidentiality is we actually just don't have the information anymore. So destruction of information is actually one mechanism for confidentiality and ensuring privacy. And we're very familiar with this approach with library circulation records, for example. But there are other approaches because there are times where we cannot destroy the information. So for example, when you have the book checked out, we do keep track of who has it checked out. And so we need different mechanisms for protecting privacy through confidentiality practices when we have data that we need to keep. So not having the data is an option in some cases, but not in all cases. And so finding that, then what do we do when we do have data? So this is the fundamental, is that we must maintain confidentiality. And I want to be very clear and make sure that we read this carefully because the word anonymous has not appeared in any of these documents. So there is no assertion that library users have a right to anonymity. They have a right to privacy and a right to confidentiality. Libraries pursuing practices that create anonymity or de-identification is one mechanism for ensuring privacy and confidentiality, but it is not the right that users have. So users don't have a right to anonymity, they have a right to privacy and confidentiality. And this is just said many, many, many times in the ALA documents, regardless of the technology used, and this is going to be key in a second, everyone who collects or accesses personally identifiable information in any format has a legal and ethical obligation to protect confidentiality. Now, how we do that is really still a challenge. So as I already mentioned, we have a lot of laws, and I'm going to constrain myself to the United States here because it's complicated enough in the United States, but we can also bring in some international components if we want. We have state confidentiality laws. 48 states and the District of Columbia have laws that protect the confidentiality of library records. Now, little footnote here, what is considered a library record in any particular state law has to be examined. So it is the case that almost all of them actually declare circulation records, right? Records of actual books checked out, journals checked out. Those are very clearly library records. It is unclear, or actually explicitly excluded in some cases, whether this would also include coverage of electronic access to, say, databases or journal articles. So we have the library records confidentiality laws, but what is a library record then becomes the question. But I want to point out as well that the majority of these laws are about confidentiality and says that these records are not subject to disclosure unless there's certain conditions met. So it's not that these records are forever closed. They're not sealed in the sense of like a court order, although even those can be unsealed, but that they are kept private or confidential unless certain conditions are met. And there's a couple conditions here. One example is user consent. I agree that you may share this information. Sometimes they might even be saying, I would like you to share this information. Court orders, subpoenas, these are other kinds of conditions under which libraries would no longer keep these confidential, but comply with certain disclosure requirements. Now, this is, of course, where data destruction is useful because you cannot have to share information that you don't have. But again, the challenge is we actually need some information in order to run our libraries. We can't just give a book across the desk and say, bring it back. We know that to protect the common good that is our collection so that it is available to our community, we need tracking mechanisms. We need mechanisms that say, you have this book checked out right now, and you're going to bring it back. So even if we have a commitment to destroying circulation records, which may or may not be the practice, while you have it checked out, we know you've got it. And so we still have to be thinking about the fact that we have records of users' information. We know who has a library card. We know that they have checked things out. We might have other information about users. So destruction of the circulation record, while not a bad strategy, it is really inadequate to the full range of library user data we have. And I can sort of start unpacking and doing even more detail, and I think you'll do this afternoon, thinking about all the data that we have. Many people haven't even thought through things like most of our print systems are networked, which means any print job that is sent to a printer is actually saved as a file on the print server. And do we know that those are being expunged? Photocopiers, actually, if you still have photocopiers in your library, also have hard drives now, where images are stored and then printed, essentially, as opposed to our kind of older photocopy technology. So, circulation records and database access are just one of our most common data points, but we have a lot of data about users. And I bet everyone who's attending this webinar today has emails where they have emailed with a user. Right? And so that fact that they have asked you a question is now sitting in your sent mail. And so what practices do we have around that? So my only point here is we have a lot of data and very little of it is actually regulated by our state laws. And so while the state laws are great, they really aren't up to the whole issue that we have. And now here's the really sticky issue. In the physical world, access to the information that a library provided to its community was indeed provided by the library. We didn't say, oh yes, we own a copy of that book. Just run down the street and tell them that you're part of our library, show your ID card, and then they'll give you access to it down the street at the bookstore or at the mall, right? We provided the physical access. So your authorization, which is you're physically present, was also your access. And it was all under, if you will, quite literally, the roof of the library. In the digital age, we actually started, I'm old enough to remember, where digital information was loaded on a server that the library controlled. So yes, it was online in certain ways, but that server was under our control. And so we would literally get CD-ROMs or hard disks in the mail, like the literal mail, and we would upload those files to a server that was then accessible to our campus networks. So again, we maintained this notion that we actually were the providers of the actual access as opposed to essentially serving as a direction and referral service. This is essentially now what has happened with our networked information resources. Libraries were unable to have, could you imagine if every single library had to have the kind of server farm that we would now need for people to access all the information that is networked? I mean, we have to be as big as Google, we have to be as big as Elsevier, as big as Wiley, we have to do all of that. No, we don't do that anymore. We have a distributed system of information access. We no longer have a centralized system. And with that distribution came the distribution of user data. Who is accessing which resource is no longer under the exclusive control of the library, where the library is managing the data on who is accessing what and is able to implement a local destruction process or local non-reporting process. Instead, access to information is distributed. It's distributed to hundreds and hundreds of servers and companies around the globe. As a result, we've discovered that not all of the library vendors or all the information providers have the same value system that libraries do. I mean, we knew this, but it wasn't such a problem for us because we got the files, we got the books. But now we're in a situation that would be the equivalent if all of us in the physical world had bought a particular journal. But then we had to tell people, okay, yes, you get access to this journal, but you have to go to this commercial site where they will check your ID, maybe write down who you are and know which library you're part of, and then you can see the physical item. So while it's tempting to think that our physical world could just be transferred to our digital in like a physical equivalency way, we would then have to bring access to digital information back under our library control in a centralized way, which honestly, it's just not feasible. It's not possible for every academic library in the world to locally host all of their subscription resources. It wasn't possible for my library, and I work at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. It's one of the largest libraries in the world. We have a $50 million collections budget. We are huge, and we could not do this. We absolutely could not do this. We don't want to do this. We'd still potentially have data breaches too. So we really have to think then, how are we going to work with our vendors? And our vendors are diverse, right? They're scholarly publishers, they're online catalog providers, they're software companies, so many different providers. So we have to think then, what is our mechanism for protecting reader privacy in the context of this distributed system? And as ALA's document sort of argues here, it's our contracts with those vendors that we have to look at, and how their local privacy policy and data collection policies are reflected in those licensing practices. In introducing me, Chris mentioned as well that I was part of the working group that helped develop these NISO consensus principles on users' digital privacy in library, publisher, and software provided systems. You can understand why we named that the NISO privacy principles. That was a group of people that got together across this sector for multiple years and tried to say, okay, what can we agree on? And we came up with 12 principles with different descriptions under each of them. So it's really great to have this kind of principles document, but principles are optional, right? And so we got a good foundation here, but they didn't get operationalized. And I only know of one scholarly publisher that mentions that they try and comply with these principles. But I will tell you that when you actually look at their practices, they say something like, we seek to comply with or to be in alignment with these principles. But if you took these principles as a checklist, they aren't in alignment. And so there's a lot of room for improvement here. So we know, everyone knows that we're tracked all over the internet. So there's a massive amount of tracking that takes place in our licensed resources, as well as our freely available resources. And we often think about tracking through things like cookies or IP address, but our web browsers themselves also have tracking technologies in them. And we could have like a 2-hour, 3-hour discussion of just how many different ways when you are on a website, the fact that you are on that website and what you are doing on it is being captured. Also, libraries in some cases are now using what I would call big data practices, and big data practices are collect it all and we'll see if any of it is useful. Many of our universities are also, and colleges are also adopting this practice when it comes to learning analytics. And so we have these big data practices that are starting to come in that don't ask us to collect for a purpose, but instead say, oh, just collect it all and we'll see what we want later. Now, you can still have confidentiality of that kind of data, but obviously there's still questions of disclosure and trust and what this does to intellectual inquiry, lots of different things. We also know that we have data breaches in our field. We have some that are more widely known than others. Many times data breaches are intentionally kind of downplayed to create to not want to create liability. But we have some very sort of infamous ones with some of the e-reader technologies that were found to be tracking readers even in open, in tracking that was able to just be sniffed by anyone who was on a network. We have actual cases of data breaches where library circulation databases of their patrons were breached. So any number of cases like this where we just have to also realize that if we have data in digital format, we should probably expect that at some point that data will be breached. And I also want to just sort of mention, and this was also true of the print world, but we also have rogue actors internally. So unfortunately, and we know this by headlines that sort of announce that library directors are fired for embezzlement or what have you, we have our values and our principles, but occasionally we have internal threats. We have internal threats to our security and the like, because we have somebody who is interested in malicious sorts of ways of acting. And so we really can't ever be passive when it comes to any user data. But when it comes to digital data, it's even more challenging. And so I just bring forward this quote that Cody Hansen is a librarian at the University of Minnesota in their IT area. And he did this study with some other colleagues looking at how much tracking just happens on a publisher's website. And this was the too long didn't read conclusion of his investigation in 2019. And I can assure you, if anything, it's worse, not better. Under current conditions, I don't believe it's possible for libraries to provide meaningful assurance of privacy or anonymity to users of licensed resources. So his point here of when we tell our users that the library protects their privacy, he put forward in this piece the argument that we really cannot substantiate that claim, that our licensing practices and the practices of our third-party providers are such that that really is a misleading statement for if we're saying that to our users. And so we might aspire to providing for privacy, but we need to be very clear to tell people that we're not achieving that right now. And this is particularly important because it's bad enough if people sort of self-censor or don't inquire, right, freely because they know they're being tracked. But it really is a disservice if we tell them that they're not being tracked, that their work is private and it's not, because they are then trusting us to be their protector, and we're not protecting them, and we're also lying to them. Strong word, but kind of real in some cases. So we have to be disclosing to our users the reality that much of their use of our licensed resources is not in any library defined way private. Their confidentiality, unless we agree that third-party providers having access to library user data that they compile with other data in the commercial marketplace is private. I personally can't go there. Doesn't feel private to me. It feels to me that our users are entering into using resources in such a way that they are not under the kinds of protections that we tell them they are under when they use library resources on site. There is no physical equivalent privacy in the digital realm. Because again, we have moved from a centralized system under the roof of the library to a decentralized system where those other parties have practices that are not in alignment with these library values. And by the way, all of what I just said assumes that libraries are actually paying for reading access. When we're paying for reading access, we might have a chance of being able to say, okay, but if you're taking our money, then here's our expectations for you. What happens with open access? When we are not paying for reading access, you see what you see on the right-hand side here. Data is the new oil. If you aren't the customer, you're the product. So who is the customer in open access? It's not the reader, it's the author. And free reading doesn't mean free services. So you might still be prompted to create a login in order to get access to ancillary services like printing or saving or the like. And it's really tempting for open access providers to move in this direction because subscriptions were ongoing revenue, but open access fees is episodic. It's at the point of publication, but there's no payment again 10 years later, right? So I'm not arguing for which of these is better. I'm saying there are implications for reader privacy. And there's this tendency then to want to monetize what is called the data exhaust. But in addition, because the author, and in some cases the funder, is the customer of open access, they are demanding to know who is reading their work. So these same vendors that we are trying to say when we're subscribing, we want it to be private, they're getting a different message that when we're paying for publishing, we want the data on readers. And we can even see this in the internal conflict in libraries that I think is there when you look at the tracking that happens on your institutional repository. You will find that you are capturing an immense amount of data about the readers of your institutional repository works, while at the same time deleting your circulation records. Because when we move from being the provisioner of reading access to hosting a publication service, we change our mindset in very interesting ways. So just as a heads up, there's some implications here, including, I think we have a very short period of time in which we're still paying for reading to really think about how we leverage that. So that's where I'm going to now, when I was asked, like share some of your own work in this area, not just the big picture of the problems. So I am a person who believes when you see a problem, you should also try and find a solution and not just do the first part of this talk, which is, whoa, such a problem. Okay, what can we do about this? How can we analyze this situation to see a theory of change, a theory of impact? Where can we push on this system that is problematic in order to change it? So I just want to say I've been working on this for almost a decade now, starting with my Value of Academic Libraries work when I was president of ACRL, which really raised some of these questions, which is if libraries are going to use user data in order to provide and communicate the value of their services, how do we do that in a way that protects user privacy through our data practices of confidentiality? And then we've got the talk I gave in 2014 with Andrew Asher at the CNI conference, where we proposed a framework for what would confidential work look like when it comes to working with vendors. NISO privacy principles in 2015. One of the pieces that I'm particularly proud of, I've written in the Scholarly Kitchen in 2018 called What Will You Do When They Come for Your Proxy Server? Which many of us rely on our proxy servers as one way of trying to minimize data transfer. But as we move to federated authentication, using SAML, these data attributes are very easily passed. They don't have to be, but they are technologically, the path is smooth. And so we need to understand what's happening with this. Worked with a number of colleagues, Andrew Asher, Dorothea Salo, a number of others on a Digital Library Federation product called an Ethics and Research Use of Library Patron Data. Glossary, explainer, just sort of place to start. Participating in the RA21 Seamless Access Working Group on Privacy. Mentioned before, I'm the co-author of a roadmap for achieving privacy in the age of analytics, a white paper. There's also a handbook that goes with that, that was published in 2019 as well. In addition, a couple of things that I'll just kind of bring to the fore that I'm working on literally this week. The first is the IMLS funded Prioritizing Privacy Data Ethics Training for Library Professionals, which is a continuing education program for librarians who are engaged with learning analytics at universities and colleges in order to improve our ability to advocate for learner privacy and an educational focus on learning analytics through our engagement with these campus projects. So Kyle Jones is my co-PI on this project, and he and I are of the viewpoint that the right approach for libraries to approach learning analytics with is a critical engagement approach. The university or the college is going to go forth with analytics, probably regardless of what the library does, but that we, because of our privacy commitments, because of our commitments to inquiry, to self-determination, that we have the opportunity and arguably the responsibility to help our universities shape these programs in a way that do prioritize privacy and student autonomy, et cetera, in the process. So we have our first cohort going through the 6-week online workshop right now. It's an e-learning course that's pretty intense, actually. We also have plans or had plans for this year to deliver a one-day workshop around the country. Needless to say, those plans were a bit derailed by the pandemic, but we are hopeful that starting in 2022, we will be able to re-engage with that part of the in-person workshops that we had planned. In addition, I have a project called Licensing Privacy, which was funded by the Mellon Foundation, in which we are trying to figure out, okay, these contracts, these licenses that we have, what mechanisms do we have in there in order to take action? How do we understand what the licenses even mean? And where is this in our priority stack when we're negotiating? We're negotiating for a lot of things with publishers and providers. And so we've done interviews with library leaders and had a webinar a couple weeks ago. Upcoming is actually with Becky Hughes, who you're going to be hearing from this afternoon. She and I are working together on another part of the project in developing a vendor contract evaluation rubric, which we will be rolling out in mid-November as well. And so we have a real opportunity here to maybe look at our licenses and how we can improve and whether there's model language. I also have been just working on raising awareness among our user community at the University of Illinois, as well as welcoming other people. This is particularly a speaker series that I ran last year called the AI Infodemic, Interrogating Algorithms of Information Seeking, and really kind of trying to understand how technology was even shaping this environment. And so this was a reading group and then a speaker series. A few other things. I am serving currently on the ALA Intellectual Freedom Committee's Privacy Subcommittee, and of the Privacy Subcommittee, the Vendor Privacy Resolution Working Group. This is like true library structure, right? ALA, Intellectual Freedom Committee, Privacy Subcommittee, Vendor Privacy Working Group that is looking to create some tools that libraries can also use, libraries of all type. I am currently serving as well on the Seamless Access, which is the SAML Shibboleth Federated Authentication Project, working with the Contract Language Working Group about how libraries and vendors can make sure that they have contract language that accurately reflects each group's understanding of what is going to happen when it comes to an implementation of SAML or federated authentication. And then finally, a colleague here at the University of Illinois, Mashuda Bashir, in the School of Information Sciences, is actually running a separate project that is specifically looking at privacy protections in public libraries. And so I'm really honored to be part of her advisory group for that. And she's doing a workshop actually literally this weekend at the Assist conference, looking at the study that she did of what's happening in public libraries, and then sort of trying to say, so what do we need to do? Because it's also not the best look in public libraries either, as far as it comes to reader privacy. So I kicked this off sort of asking whatever happened to reader privacy. And, you know, I think it's easy to be frustrated or challenged or even angry at sometimes about what has happened with reader privacy. But I prefer to take what is known as a sort of an appreciative inquiry theory kind of mindset approach to this, which is to ask ourselves, okay, but what do we want? What future do we want? Are we satisfied with the direction of travel? And if not, what do we do to make it different? What resources, what approaches, what strategies do we have to draw upon so that we don't sit in this moment of sudden realization that, oh my gosh, this isn't what we meant to have happen. And I truly believe it's not what we meant to have happen, but I also think we maybe weren't paying as close attention as we should have been while it was happening. But here we are. We can only choose a way forward. And so I've shared with you today some of the things that I'm doing to try and move forward. There are a lot of other people working in this area. I hope that you will join in on this and that this has been a useful way of both understanding the framing as well as potentially like where in this system can we push and move and make it a little better or a lot better eventually. So let's go ahead and move to questions and comments. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing just so there's no need for this particular slide, but thank you so much for the opportunity to share probably way too many thoughts on this topic.
No, thank you. You unfolded this whole issue really well, and I appreciate this. And I actually haven't thought too much about this since I left public libraries and got into mostly because I'm an instruction librarian, so I'm not working with the data or anything like that. But So we have a question, well, a few questions in the Q&A. So so please ask more questions. Otherwise, you just get to hear all of my questions. But so this question relates to the state laws. So the first question, so there are two questions in this, so I'll just read both questions and we'll see. So the question is, where do you recommend we go to learn more about our state confidentiality laws? And is it worth returning to our own library's policies that might contain confidentiality provisions? So it's two places they're wondering how to look and how to approach that.
Right, absolutely. Great questions. So the first thing I'm going to say is ALA has this great website called State Library Confidentiality Laws or something like that. I mean, you all are master Googlers, so you'll find it. But that website not only has this overview that I quoted from, but it actually has a link state by state by state. So you can get immediately off to the state that you're in order to look at what the law is. There are 2 states that don't have a law, but then they have attorney general sort of opinions that have been issued on this topic. So it just depends. It is a state by state situation. So the second question about library policy is, I don't know who this was, but what a brilliant question. I attended a library privacy forum in New York City at the Library Association of New York. And I heard a speaker there who inspired me and maybe scared me a little bit because he pointed out that most library websites, when you go to their privacy policy, they're actually statements of aspiration, not of description. And he made a very strong point that depending on the kind of institution you are, this becomes more and more an issue. But in some cases, we are creating legal liability by the way that we are describing things, because digital data is actually regulated not just by sort of general things, but also the FTC. And some other agencies. And so just depending what you have said, you potentially have legal liability if you are in this aspirational mode of, we protect your privacy, we believe in privacy, we do everything possible. We actually do not do everything possible. So he just basically, long story short, said, policies need to be descriptive, not aspirational. You can write an aspirational statement in your values, in your strategic plan, but when it comes to informing users about what is actually happening to them, you have to tell them the truth, even if we don't like it. If we don't like the reality of today, we have to tell them the truth. I believe that ethically, but if ethics isn't enough for you, legal liability and financial liability is usually a good sort of like additional clap with that. So I just really think we need to look at those policies, and we need to like have our commitment as librarians, right? Like, we're committed to truthful, accurate information, and that has to come from us too, even when we don't like it. And then we have to work to make reality closer to our vision so that we can revise that statement so that that statement of what is true is more aligned with our actual reality. So at my own institution, I came back, we immediately had a task force and revised our policy. It wasn't horrible, but it definitely was not as disclosing as we needed it to be.
Yeah. Awesome, great answers. And in case anyone's wondering, someone did put the Advocacy, Privacy, State Laws, ALA website link in the chat. All right, so we have another question here. Are there any examples, so this is from Allison, she asked, are there any examples of a library successfully contracting a license with clauses on stricter privacy protections than legally required with a publisher or resource?
So legally required is an interesting thing because, of course, you have to do what's legally required. The biggest change that I've seen libraries have to do with is many times our vendor contracts say that the controlling privacy policy will be what is on their website. In other words, they don't reproduce the privacy policy in the contract itself. We just say, hey, see the website. This is not an unreasonable approach. except that that policy includes in it, they can update it whenever they want. So, okay, even that, we could say like that's still legal, right? That is because there's disclosure, but the library was, what I've seen libraries able to do is require notification when that policy changes. So that, because the difficulty is that policy is actually displayed to the user. And the user is the one who's told this has changed since the last time we were here, if they know who you are, which they probably do. So the user is told this has been updated, but I mean, my library has 1,000 databases on our database list. We're not going there every day to see if it tells me that it's been updated. So what libraries have been able to do is say that the vendor is required to proactively notify the library that the policy has been updated. Now, that's what the policy, that's what the contract says. I know of no library that is actually auditing compliance with that policy. Okay, so we can have things in our contracts that makes them probably more likely to happen, but it doesn't guarantee they happen. Because our contracts also say that they have to have a certain amount of uptime and they have to respond to help tickets in a certain amount of time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mostly that's what happens, but not always. And so, you know, enforcement of contracts or audit or monitoring is another question. So right now, even just getting, right now, mostly it's we will comply with the law, is the privacy policy and the data disclosure. But in addition, there is this challenge that like, that only can sort of come into play once the user is accessing something that's restricted. So as long as they haven't like authenticated yet, like if they're on a publisher site and they haven't yet said, I am at the University of Illinois, they're being treated as a public user of that website, which means that our contract doesn't apply. They're just there as a public user, that the publisher doesn't know that they're one of our faculty or one of our students. And so that's where the whole question of web-based tracking, browser cookies, et cetera. So now the user has said, essentially by their behavior on the site, yes, I agree with your privacy policy. And so there's also this question. So then when they authenticate, the user has given the platform the permission to track them. And that means that now, now we see we have these two regimes going on. We've got the contract and we've got the user's agreement with the platform. So this is another question now, which overrides which? And then because we have, instead of saying, oh, each library will get a copy and then we will control access to that copy, we now all use the same resource. So we really have to have a uniform policy on that website in order for this to be possible at all, this kind of distributed model. And so we also have to speak in a coherent way to the vendor community from the library community. And I definitely can agree with the vendors who say that they are not hearing a coherent, unified message from the library community on this, of what is it that we want. And so this is part of what I'm trying to do with licensing privacy, is help craft a statement that they can sort of say, okay, we may not agree with this, but now at least we know what you're talking about.
Awesome, thanks. So
sorry, I start talking and then 5 minutes passes.
So, okay, so we have another question here. This kind of gets at the other side of the issue. So are you aware of any work in the field that focuses on ways that libraries can educate authors or researchers about the importance of reader privacy as they increasingly work directly with open access publishers? So this would be the authors of these works, and can we teach them how to discuss this with the publishers, I guess is the question.
So I think we need to really sort of think through this and think through sort of motivations, et cetera. The author is motivated to want tracking. They want to know who's reading my work, how much are they reading it. This is the value that ResearchGate and academia.edu provides them. And so we would really have to really seriously engage with our authors' stated interests and have them decide that reader privacy is more important to them than the data that they want about their own publications. Now, I want to also mention, because I just said authors, but I know multiple cases where libraries have an APC fund, for example, and they are going to these very publishers and saying, hey, we funded these 10 articles. How much were they read? Tell me how much they were read. Now, they're not actually asking who, but they are asking for tracking when they ask those questions. And so this is where I'm not even sure that libraries are on the reader privacy side of open access when it comes to them acting as a funder. And then I'll come back to look at our own house. If we are a publisher, if we have an institutional repository, what's even on your own website? And the kinds of tracking that is happening. Jason Clark and Scott Young at Montana State University, who are my co-authors on that web handbook that was mentioned, that's some of the work they've done, really looking at the fact that, you know, a lot of library websites have Google Analytics on them, which seems less private than what we say we want to be doing for reader privacy.
So if you have a question, throw it in the Q&A. I actually have sort of a devil's advocate question, if you'll
Absolutely, go for it.
So my devil's advocate question is, why should our users care if they're being tracked by these distant entities? I could understand if, you know, if a parent comes into a public library and says, you know, what's my teenager reading? Like that's like a local issue, but why should we care that we're being tracked by all these computers that we don't even know about?
So I'm not sure that every user actually does care about reader privacy. I want to distinguish between our own professional commitments, which is how we understand society to work and what's good for us collectively, from what any individual might choose. But I will answer on the individual level in this way. We have entered an era in which agreement to being tracked is not a separate decision from I need access to this resource. And so we know, however, that when people have done some studies where they give readers the ability to sort of make a different, they can make a distinct decision. You can track me and I want access to this. So in other words, I can not be tracked and not get access. That's like the default of all of us. Or I can get access without tracking, or I can get access and deny your ability to track me. We do see that not everyone consents to being tracked. So the fact that people are so, as it said, willing to give away their privacy, they just click consent all the time. Well, that's because they don't have an option. So you can't say, if you're only comparing no access versus access with tracking, that people are happy being tracked. What we know is that they want access, and that access comes with tracking. We know that if you give people the choice, some of them will consent to tracking and others of them will not. So this does come back though from the library perspective now, if I can say, which is we have a decision to make as well though, which is whether we will take that choice away from the user by saying we will not allow any tracking by our contract, or we will require user consent for that tracking. There are some people who argue that as libraries, we are ethically obligated to prevent them from being able to choose to be tracked. That is not my perspective, because I think that that denies another important value, which is autonomy. But I do think that people should be given the choice in this matter. So there's this just like there's layers and layers and layers, but I'm seeing from the chat, you know, a lot of great conversation. And I know that in your workshop this afternoon, and so I was thrilled when I heard that Becky was your workshop, because, well, I'm working with her on the licensing privacy, but she's one of the sharpest people working in this area. I'm also aware that I have talked right up to the minute here.
No, that's great. Well, thank you so much. think we're going to end it here. I have a lot of other questions, but yeah, so we have, we're going to have a 15-minute break, and then we're going to have our lunchtime chat. And then later on, we're going to have our workshop. So hopefully everyone has all of the links to those. We had to do these as separate things, but I wish we could give you a round of applause, but I guess everyone can just clap in their offices for Lisa. And yeah, I think this is going to give us all a lot to think about.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to be able to share this information with you. And I'm always happy for people to contact me. My Gmail is also Lisa Librarian. So I'm pretty easy to find, and I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with folks. And do watch for when we get some of our in-person training coming, because I'd love to see you in person too.
Thank you, Rachel.